Why don't we get started then? And let me welcome today's presenters. We have David Porteous, co-founder and chair of BFA, and Amalo Nueno, CEO of BFA Global. So I'll ask you to introduce yourselves briefly, David, and then Amalo.
Sure. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I am the chair of BFA, and I've been involved in work like this around the topic of digital work and livelihoods on digital platforms for the last few years. So it's a pleasure to be with you and share some of the thoughts arising from recent work.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amalo Nueno. I'm the CEO of BFA Global. I'm based in Nairobi. And along with David, we conducted some of the research and stakeholder interviews and understanding of the iWorker phenomenon and how it's playing out in Ghana that we're about to present to you. So we're looking forward to an interactive session. I'll also be hosting a panel towards the later part of the session and look forward to your feedback and interaction with that.
Hi, my name is Bright Simmons.
Thank you, Bright. Thank you, Amalo. So before we get started, let me just walk our audience through the session itself. The session is 1.5 hours. I think we'll finish a little bit earlier. And you may post comments and questions during the session by clicking on the Q&A. As an attendee, if you look down at the bottom of the Zoom interface, you should see the Q&A button. And today we're recording the webinar so that we can make the recording available to those who could not attend. Okay, I'd like to run a quick poll just to get a sense of how the audience thinks about today's topic. So we're running the first poll. You should see a poll running in front of your screen right now, to which you could answer, when you think of gig work, what comes to mind? I'll give a few seconds for our attendees to mark their answers. Okay, we have about almost 80% of you voting. So I'll stop the poll here and share the results. Seems like a fairly optimistic group here, which is interesting. You can see that it falls largely on flexibility and opportunity. And some of the other less positive aspects are low wages, low skill, exploitation, all under 21%. Great, thank you. I'll take you to the next poll to get a sense of who's in the room. Who's in the audience today? Are you a policymaker, researcher? Do you work for a platform company? Are you a gig worker, investor, or a program officer or funder? You guys are much faster this time. I see almost 85, almost 90% of the audience has voted. So many of you are coming from the research side. Let me just end that and share. Many of you coming from the research side, from programs. A large group of you are other. Be interesting to see who you are later. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that with us. And we'll move on from the polls and move to the presentation, which I'll pass over to you, David, to you David and Amla, to give the presentation. So I'm going to pass control over to you. Give me 1 second. And it seems like you have control now.
Great. Thank you, Jane. And again, good morning or good afternoon to all of you. What I'm going to do is pass through quite quickly the topic of the report that's launched today on a website where you can find it together with other material on the subject of gig workers, or as we would call them, iWorkers, as the broader category that we'll talk to. So I'm going to try and do this quite quickly, 15 minutes, 20 minutes max, to allow time for the conversation, which is really the most interesting part, I think, especially with the panelists that we have here. And I do want to start actually by acknowledging the contributions that they and others have already made to this Ghana report. So the MasterCard Foundation financed the study, and Tricia Williams, who's here on the panel in particular, was closely involved. Bright Simmons was a collaborator in the work and one of the workshops in Ghana where this was discussed. Kosi Yankee's people were interviewed as part of this, and there were a whole number of other people in Ghana, including, I'm happy to say, some of these gig workers or iWorkers themselves. They're not on this call, as we saw, not surprisingly, but they were very much part of the voices and the people in the room, including in the workshop where some of these recommendations were discussed. So to do this, let me start with just trying to frame the, if I can advance the screen here. Give me 1 moment, there we are. There we go, there's a slight lag. Just give you a sense of context. So as we talk today about gig work, or this broader framing of iWork, to put it in perspective, it's come out of looking at the broader category, in fact, the broadest category of digital commerce, of which e-commerce is a well-known part, but digital commerce increasingly used as the broader term. And so starting a couple of years ago, we developed some scenarios looking at the future of digital commerce. We saw that under almost all scenarios in Africa, the share of digital commerce in total commerce is likely to increase. But the key question is, so what? What does it mean? And in particular, what does it mean for low-income people and low-income workers? And so it was out of that work where we developed this focus around the production side of digital commerce, hence the focus on iWorkers, which I will define further in a moment. And then last year, we had the opportunity to specifically apply some of the thinking about how do you enable this to happen with good outcomes for low-income people and workers in Ghana. And that's specifically the report that we want to talk about today. Just to put Ghana in perspective briefly, I think we all know that the numbers around measuring digital commerce in general are still pretty immature and quite variable. Most people tend to focus on that measure on the left-hand side, which is just one category, B2C, of e-commerce. And you can see that on a typical global scale, where it's measured, African countries, South Africa, the only one here with that measure, typically pretty low. If we take a demand side view, which is the right-hand side, and this comes out of Global Findex, and we ask of adults on a statistically weighted basis, have you bought something online? Well, the numbers, of course, look higher. Kenya, one of the largest in Africa, although well behind China, which we know is a global leader in that respect. And Ghana, just to contextualize, falling very close to South Africa. Now, those are numbers from now almost 3 years ago. We await the latest ones, but we can be pretty sure that they've increased in the intervening time. Now, those numbers were about the consumption side of e-commerce. Have you bought something online? As I said at the beginning, our real interest here was actually the other side, the production side, the income generation or inclusive growth side of digital commerce. And in the original report, we identified these 3 different channels of impact between rising digital commerce and different forms of employment or work. Now today, the focus is primarily on the third one, an indirect channel, which is digital commerce is changing the nature of work. It's changing it through platforms like gig platforms that translate what were previously jobs into bundles of tasks or micro tasks. So that's not to ignore the other two channels. We could talk about them, but today the focus is on the third one. Now, what's interesting about the narrative here, and this was our starting point, is that when we look at the nature of work in developed or wealthy northern countries, and in Africa specifically as a focus, it's different. This picture from an ILO report looks at the share of informal employment in total employment in all those countries, where the red shades, less than 20%, you can see how that maps pretty closely to high income or OECD or part of OECD status, whereas the darker the green, the higher the proportion of informal employment. And so in Africa, that overall number, 85% reported there, surely has implications for the ways in which technology is changing work and what that means. It has to be different. And perhaps there's a different discourse possible, which was the spirit of that poll question. So much of the discourse in the red countries right now tends to verge on the negative, which is the risks and the problems with gig work. Whereas could it be that in those greener countries, there's a different opportunity? And some of the poll results around flexibility and opportunity suggest indeed that those aspects might be there. So I've mentioned this word, iWorkers. What do we mean by it? Well, we're talking here about people whose livelihood is enabled by their digital connectivity. Now, that's a broad term. Let's translate it into the typical categories one looks at in a workforce. So the box that you see on your screen there really just distinguishes at the top between people who are employed by someone else or self-employed, traditional categorization. And then on the left-hand side, the legal status of the work, formal or informal, where the definition of formal, informal comes out of the ILO report, because indeed the percentages that you see in each of these four windows here are out of the ILO numbers for West Africa. They don't provide it at country level, so for Ghana, but there's reason to believe Ghana is not that different from the rest. So you can see that this block, top left-hand corner, employed formally is a tiny proportion of the total workforce. Whereas you can see equally the opposite block, self-employed informal, by far the largest block, with a surprisingly big block that's actually employed by someone, but without formal contract, formal benefits, all the protections and things that go with the ILO definition of formal work. So when we use this term iWork, it's deliberately a broad term, and it covers the broad area shown in this box here. So certainly gig workers are part of iWork, and in northern countries, and indeed in Ghana, we found often those can be employed people doing something on the side. That's side work in the little blocks there. Also freelancers who may be self-employed people. Often in the north, they would be up here, they would be formally employed, but in Ghana, informally employed often. And then including small online merchants, where we've had other conversations in the past about how across Africa, even if not yet acquired on e-commerce platforms, small merchants are finding ways to enable their livelihoods to sell more using Instagram, to manage client relations using WhatsApp, for example. And that's becoming more and more sophisticated. And we actually met people in Ghana who were doing that today. So that's the definitional concept we're talking about, people whose livelihoods are enabled by their connectivity. But that's just a definition. The real question is, for iWork, can it be good work? In other words, for people whose livelihoods are dependent in this way, can their income stabilize? Can it grow over time? Or is there the risk of this race to the bottom, this risk which was highlighted in the answers of some of you to that initial poll question? So to see this in Ghana, what we did was to frame 6 hypotheses, which you see on your screen, about what would enable iWork that is more likely to constitute good work, more likely to lead to those good outcomes for inclusive growth, which we're concerned about. Now, the 6 there include infrastructural factors, as you would expect. For example, number 1, about internet access, not just it's available, but is it affordable? Secondly, the payments infrastructure, because after all, that online livelihoods are dependent on the ability to receive payments and indeed to make payments as well. The statements go on, as you can see, into some of the policy and regulatory issues of the legal environment for labor. That's number 3. And then tax, because the tax code actually has a large effect on the definitions of formality and the incentives to participate. The statements that we looked at included looking at some of the demand side, which is, do workers themselves see benefits from becoming involved in work that enables them to be traced, to be formalized in certain ways? And then finally, as you can see, number 6 there, that the platforms that support and indeed foster and encourage forms of this work are indeed active and growing. And so for each of these statements, we developed a scorecard, which is available in your report for Ghana. And what you can see on your screen here is merely the summary number that comes out of, in each case, looking at 3 or 4 or sometimes 5 underlying categories that were tested as part of the work in Ghana and discussed with the various participants. Now, the scale here is scale of 1 would mean basically the statement doesn't apply at all. It's just not there. Whereas a 5, and again, this was benchmarked to African standards, strongly true. In other words, highly enabling in each of these categories. So you can see that the average result, with some variation for Ghana, ended up being close to just above a 3. In other words, a relatively clear and open environment. That's what we saw in terms of some of the labor law and even the tax code, actually, with some remarkable provisions there, but not an environment which is yet perceived to be enabling, and one in which there's a lot of fragmentation among some of the digital commerce platforms in Ghana today. All of which mean that that middling level score implies more could be done if one wanted to enable iWork in Ghana today. So essentially what we were doing is testing these hypotheses about what could hold it back. That's the flip side of those enabling statements. And obviously the factors on the supply side and the demand side. And you can see how those hypotheses, for example, the cost of working online is just too high, were part of the equation. In fact, in Ghana, the cost of data is kind of mid-range by African standards, actually slightly cheaper. So that wasn't a major factor. More major often were some of the aspirations of workers themselves, which we looked at in a survey of young people in Ghana today. And of course, the more general fact that we're still at a relatively early stage of development. The best estimates we've seen in Ghana is that perhaps 1%, probably more now, of people are on iWork platforms, but that there is not still yet a volume of work which is pulling a large number of people onto the platforms. Hence, we have the traditional two-sided platform issue. So that's what this report that you see, the picture of the front page here, summarizes, and you're able to download that. Let me just finish by setting up quickly an overview of some of the things the report recommended specifically in the Ghanaian context, because they may frame some of the discussion that we have afterwards. So you can see that, in fact, across these range of stakeholders, it's very diverse. It's not just about the financial service authorities, although they're there. It's about trade and industry, negotiating international treaties within Africa, like the Continental Free Trade Agreement, that have implications for the export of iWork services, even in the region, and the Ministry of Labor. And most of these were, in fact, represented in the workshop that we had at the end. Main recommendation, just to highlight, is in Ghana, there's actually a lot going on, but it's often fragmented. It's within particular ministries that aren't necessarily talking with one another, let alone with the iWorkers themselves or those on the private sector side. So the counterpart to that, thinking about the digital commerce sector more broadly, which included iWorkers, you can read a number of recommendations, but one of those is to find a way to articulate the interests of private platforms, Ghanaian-based platforms, for example, to government, because it was striking to the international trade expert who was part of our team that in Ghana there wasn't that much interaction with the private sector groups, whereas in other countries that are part of international trade negotiations, often there's an intensive process of advocacy and consultation with the private sector to make sure that the interests are understood and that the government position, to at least some extent, can reflect that. We also looked at international development organizations. And I guess the bottom line of that set of detailed recommendations is to say, especially at the early stage of the development of iWork, there really is a need for catalysts, those organizations who are willing to assume some of the risks, some of the resource costs of enabling the early stage development that points in the right direction. That could be research, but there's also the possibility to do a lot more. And for example, the long-term concept that's described in the report for a country like Ghana might be a situation in which there are multiple iWorker type platforms for different sectors, in which there really is a connection between what we've called here aggregators, who might be training institutes for different sectors, as you can see across the categories of iWork. The point today is simply to say that the links between training and work are not well formed today in many countries. And so the ultimate picture we would see would be much closer links between aggregators who acquire workers and skill them, and the platforms that market their services that actually create an income. That means that there's a return on that training and investment today. So we could certainly talk more about that long-term picture. I'm sure we will. Let me finish though with simply showing you a screenshot from the website, which is available also from today, iWorkerproject.org. If you go there, you'll be able to access not only the Ghana report in the Resource Center, but a whole range of other findings, including blogs over the last year and more, together with quizzes about iWork and videos of actual iWorkers. These faces you see here are in fact Ghanaians who actually are doing different forms of iWork today. And then lastly, there's a projection tool. So that 5 million number that you heard about in the flyer for this webinar comes out of applying a projection tool across labor force estimates for Ghana to 2030, and then assuming different numbers about digital connectivity and the proportions of people who rely on that, therefore are iWorkers. And so at least in a high scenario, applying some standardized assumptions, that's where the 5 million come from. The point is, it's a large number. The question is it going to be a good number? Good for inclusive growth, good for Africa, good for the iWorkers themselves. And I think that's very much the topic of conversation in today's video. So thank you for letting me do this projection. Let you take over, Amala.
Thank you, David. I'm going to take the control back. And we will move over to some Q&A. I haven't seen any questions come through. So if there's anyone that wants to submit a question, I was thinking from after the presentation, they could submit it now, but we'll also have a Q&A session, time for Q&A after the panel discussion. So before I pass it over to Amalo to moderate the discussion with David Porteous and our other panels today, let me take you to our next poll to gauge your reaction to iWork as presented by David. So poll number 3. Digitally enabled work, or iWork, will promote dignified and fulfilling work, exploitation of workers, unsure. I'll give a few more seconds for the responses to come through. In the meantime, David, we did have a question coming in from Horan. Could I get further explanation on the point about limited interaction between private sector and government?
Sure, I'd be happy to respond to that. So the point there was simply that in a number of countries which are participating in some of the international debates around trade frameworks for e-commerce, for example, and those are very alive right now. There are big splits globally going on. But in many of those countries, there's an active consultation process between the government's Ministry of Trade and private sector, the organizations in the country affected by those trade measures. And the point was simply, at least last year in Ghana, there was less evidence that that had been happening. Now, of course, there are many factors there. One is that the more organized the private sector is in trade bodies and so on, the easier it is to do. The more fragmented, like digital commerce is, the harder to do. And of course, it's a function of resource in the ministries of trade and so on. But the observation of the trade expert that we had with us was to say that simply more could be done here, because particularly for a country like Ghana, with a skills base in West Africa and beyond, English speaking by and large, there are opportunities for the export of services online. And that requires that some of these treaties at least don't stand in the way of it.
Thank you. From another attendee, we have asking, what are some of the different types of digital financial services or products that have been shown?
Jane, we've lost you there.
What are some of the different types of digital financial services or products that have been shown to enable iWorkers to generate or maintain their income?
These are digital financial services and products. Yeah, so good question, because one of the issues which was discussed was very much around what forms of financial service could enable, for example, the spreading of income over time, because the nature of iWork is that income patterns are often very volatile. It's feast or famine, and there's a need to spread it. Now, at least when we were there, and at least in the conversations we had then, there were limited examples that I was aware of as of then, although I'm sure people like Cozy and Bright could add more of what's been going on in Ghana. Certainly outside of Ghana, there are a number of interesting fintech applications which are offering things like the ability for people who work on these platforms to spread the income. In other words, not take it all received directly into a transaction account, but to put it in savings wallets, for example, as a way to deal with risk. There are options that build in different forms of insurance and easy access. And this, of course, is the world of portable benefits, which is ideally what we would all like to see around forms of digital work or iWork in future.
Great. Couldn't you hear me? Yes, okay. We have another question asking by an attendee, are there any hypotheses around what business models might work for the aggregators that would provide training in the model you laid out? Would the iWork platforms be in a better position to provide those?
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting question there which others on the panel could contribute to as well, but let me at least say this, which is that our observation is at the moment that there are these two very different business models. There are training institutes, which are often government or donor funded because of their public purpose in putting people through them. They're also private equivalents, but in Ghana, certainly we're aware of the public ones. And then there are the platforms, and the two tend to stand quite apart. Whereas the point of that picture was to say you could merge them. In other words, is there the opportunity for platforms to backward integrate to include training functionality? Certainly, that's possible. And indeed, platforms are doing that in other parts of the world. However, at least as a starting point, better connections between training institutes that focus on particular sectors, we could talk about that among panelists here, and work platforms may be a way to allow some of the specialization that is required around training and acquiring workers, which not all digital work platforms are equipped to do. They just don't have the resource to go after one particular sort of worker or one particular sort of training. So I could foresee integrated models, but it seems that at least better connecting platforms with training institutes is a feasible way forward.
Thank you, David. We do have more questions coming in, but I think we can bring that to the second half when we invite you to ask questions again. Let me also share the results from poll number 3. Again, we have quite an optimistic group here in terms of thinking about the future of iWork. 51% of you thought it would lead to decent and fulfilling work, and a good number of you, almost over a third, were unsure. So from here, I'd like to move on to our panel discussion, and that will be moderated by Amalo Nguenu, whom we presented earlier. So let me take a few seconds to also have our panelists introduce themselves briefly. So let's have Bright first, then Trisha, then Cozy.
Thank you, Jane. My name is Bright Simmons. I'm a social entrepreneur and technologist, and also a public interest researcher from Ghana, but operating currently in a number of countries in Africa and South Asia.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Trisha Williams. I'm the thematic research lead at the MasterCard Foundation and was involved in working with BFA on this research project. And I'm currently joining from Nairobi.
And Cozy?
Hi, good afternoon from Ghana. My name is Kosi Yankee. I'm the Executive Director for the National Board for Small Scale Industries, which is mandated to strengthen and grow micro, small, and medium enterprises in Ghana and support entrepreneurs. And we worked closely, some of our staff on the ground, for this research, and so it's of great interest to us.
Thank you so much. Amalo, please go ahead and take the lead on moderating. Hi, Amalo. If you're speaking, it's not coming through. Okay, I think I'm not able to establish if there is a connection problem from the Nairobi side. So let's give her 1 minute to make sure this can go through.
I'm sorry.
Oh, hi, Amalo.
Yes, hi. I will kick off, but I've been having a little problem with my connection. So in case I get lost again, I think Jane will just take over moderating what is aiming to be a very interesting panel. So let me just kick off. Maybe Trisha, you would start.
I'm not sure if I'm the only one not hearing Amalo. It's hard for me to tell because I don't have a reaction from the other side other than from the panelists. So if you are not hearing Amalo, maybe you could just let me know through the Q&A. Okay, great, thank you. So what we can do then is I'll ask everyone to take off their video from the panelist side. Thank you, and I'm also going to take off this version, stop sharing my screen for now. Okay.
Jane, I think it would be best if you go ahead with questions because my connection is really
Sure, Amala, that's not a problem. I'm happy to do that. So just give me 1 second. I think my connection is also suffering a little bit from the size of this webinar.
I think I was asking Tricia to go ahead and give a little background on MasterCard Foundation's interest in iWorkers and how it fits in your strategy, since you supported this work.
Certainly, I'm happy to get us started. And thank you so much to Amalo and to David for the great introduction. It brings it all back. What an exciting project this has been. So I think as many people on the call will know, the MasterCard Foundation has set an ambitious target of reaching 30 million young people in Africa with dignified and fulfilling work opportunities by 2030. And a lot of people start by saying, oh, that's such a big number, 30 million young people. But really, it's only a fraction of the challenge. So I think, we've looked at various estimates that have predicted, almost 400 million young people in the labor market in Africa by 2030. And this, as you can see, we're just, trying to bite off a small chunk of that challenge. And even that is a big challenge. But really, I think what this requires us to do is think about scale and impact in a new way, and at a way that really invites thinking about broader systemic change. And this is one of the things that leads us to look at digital work or iWork so closely, and that we think it could be a really big driver of transformation and opportunity. But it doesn't come without risks. So I think a lot of the dialogue about the future of work, as David has already alluded to, is really about how work is changing. And the work opportunities of the past may not be the same work opportunities of the future. Or you may have work that takes place in a slightly different way. So you may have always hailed a taxi, but now that's facilitated and enabled by platforms and apps. But really, I think we consider looking at digital work or iWorkers experiences as really critical to understanding both how those jobs and work opportunities will arise and the extent to which those opportunities can be made dignified and fulfilling. So what are the conditions, what are the opportunities or environment that needs to be in place to ensure that young people can make a real living and can really realize their aspirations and their dreams?
Great, thank you, Tricia. So I think several of us have been having connectivity issues, so I thank everyone for the patience, and great for us to be able to get the panel discussion going. Let me bring the question next to Cozy. The Ghana Diagnostic provided a picture of a relatively enabling environment, and the question was around the coordination. How does this align with your view of what's happening in Ghana?
Thank you very much. I think that this really aligns with my view of what the enabling environment currently looks like, especially for the iWorker space, and reinforces some of the numbers that we are seeing in terms of GDP growth going up and citizen spending power, looking at both the formal and informal retail space, looking at internet access, where in Ghana it's estimated that about 10.1 million people have access to internet and mobile data. So the internet access is relatively widespread, reliable, affordable, is also quite relative looking at the current situation that we have here in Ghana. You also realize that there's also an enabling environment, an expansion or improvement in certain sectors such as tourism or expatriates, which is boosting some of these gig economies or the iWorker space. So looking in terms of Uber and others which are in Ghana, growing at a pace that we see. And it all falls on the relatively enabling environments that we currently have. Looking at also the micropayment systems where you have new players in the market, and you have various payment systems coming in, and with the Bank of Ghana coming in with various policies to ensure that the environment that supports the payment systems is actually enables for the growth in that sector. looking at the work that we do, a lot of it focuses on how we can strengthen and grow and create jobs in alignment with what MasterCard is also doing. So in looking at the environment, there's a lot of room for improvement as well. You look at it in terms of, will this enable more women to come on board as well? Because globally you have 12% less women using the internet. And this is an opportunity for more people to be able to get employed. So how do we factor in this and enable and create an enabling environment that brings on board the women? Would it be the legal environment, or is it the tax code? And what does that role does it have to play in strengthening more women to come on board to be able to play a role? But relatively, this really, the diagnostic plays in and shows that yes, there is the environment which is being enabled, and there's some room and a lot of room for improvement, even in terms of policy, to ensure that there's a lot more work done and a lot more inclusion for more people, especially the youth, to play a role in the economy.
Perfect. Thank you, Kosi. Well, we'll come back to that, but in terms of understanding some of the more excluded populations or populations that are desirable to target. David, based on Kosi's response and from the diagnostic report, which was just over last year, were any of the findings unexpected from the perspective of the Ghana diagnostic report? And if so, what were they?
Well, Jane, so no, I think a lot of them were in line with the expectations one has of Ghana, which is a country that has a pretty clear common law regime and has traditionally, in areas like, for example, digital finance in the past, tried to take quite an enabling role. And so you see some of that clarity reflected in some of the legal and policy scoring. I guess the part that was perhaps less expected for me were things like the perceptions of young workers in Ghana, that the perceptions reflect the fact that people are still wanting a job. They still want literally a good job, as they say. And this is not Ghana alone. I saw a recent Economist article that reflected the expectations of young people worldwide are still, for example, to join professions, to become professionals, lawyers, doctors, and so on, teachers, all of which, of course, are taking strain in different ways at different places as the result of technology. So the one surprise for me probably was the relatively low score you see in the diagnostic about expectations on the part of iWorkers, seeming to be out of sync with some of the reality people are confronted with and have been for a long time.
Very interesting. Right, what about your perspective? You recently published a blog about the age of platforms and how that's being replaced by what you call hyper-integration. Can you share your thinking, what you mean by it, and what that implies for iWorkers?
Thanks, Jane. And like Tricia, I'm also delighted that finally we're seeing the culmination of many months of work around iWork. My congratulations to MasterCard and BFA for persisting through all the challenges of data collection and like to launch the iWorkerproject.org site finally. Regarding the work that I did, and here too, Tricia and I were part of a working group, a study group in fact, put together by the Center for Global Development to try and see how the future of technology, comparative advantage, and the future of employment all intersect around the new phenomenon that we're observing in the world. And that is the source of the insights that went into the paper that you just mentioned, Jane. And that paper is very multidimensional. So I'm going to follow your lead and indeed narrow down significantly only to the parts that are relevant to this discussion about iWork. And that part centers on the notion of platforms themselves. The current dominant thinking about platforms really is about what you might call network effects and how those network effects generate power. What do I mean by that? So typically the view is that if you build a sufficiently smart application and you design it in such a manner that other people could write on that application to build other services. So if you think of the traditional digital application, it's one particular company providing service to another company. However, we saw increasingly situations where people build platforms, and on top of those platforms, other people build businesses and services. Now, the view was, if you did it so well, you started to accrete a large number of participants in that space. And then, as more participants increase, the value to each of those participants becomes greater and greater. And those network effects then develop into a situation where you are close to a monopoly in that particular domain that you operate in, and that generates power. So as far as iWork is concerned, a lot of the platforms that are of interest nowadays, whether in the e-commerce space, whether in the e-lancing space, have tended to be mega platforms. So Uber has been mentioned, Airbnb has been mentioned, there is obviously also the Odesk and Upwork and these various other distributed work platforms. Now, the question that was been boggling a lot of minds is, are you going to see this platform concentration develop to a point where the flexibility that people have mentioned is no longer, can no longer be taken for granted because it's just so much platform power? Whether it's an Uber owner or it's an Airbnb owner, can that owner be too powerful and powerful to the point where the flexibility that we take for granted could start to be suppressed? So that's a question that arises from any theory of platform power that we contend with. So that's one. Number two, we discuss opportunity, or at least a lot of people are quite sure that iWork represents opportunity. But opportunity, in a certain sense, presupposes diversity. So diversity of opportunity. The question is, if you have a monopoly operator, an oligarchic operator, is it possible that they could limit opportunity? So those were some of the questions going into our analysis as we built the theory that I'm going to describe in a few seconds. And the hybrid integration view is that, or the view of hybrid integration is that this platform concentration position, while true in certain respects, has been overblown. So yes, there are a few platforms like your Facebooks, your Uber, your Instagrams and the like, where this network effect has led to a situation where these platforms are genuinely dominant. But the argument is that there are a few that are benefiting from legacy arrangements, and that going forward, we're going to see a major change. One critical development that has led to this new view is the fact that we need to modify the network effect theory into something that you might want to call a modular network theory. So what that means simply is that even though it's actually true that the more participants in a network there are, the more valuable the benefits to all the other participants, the fact of the matter is that increasingly it's now not too difficult for these participants to be grouped in such a manner that they can be shifted to other platforms. Where do we see evidence of this happening? I'll give you a very quick example. In payments, it was for a long time, the view of many experts that MasterCard, Visa, Europay, and the like were so dominant that we've gone to a point where it's practically impossible for any other payment platforms to compete with the card networks. So the card networks are completely dominant. And as we observed, the impression was that this was going to continue. The truth of the matter is that if you look at a place like Ghana, today the GAPES, that is the government operator of the national switch, is actually slowly creating a counterpoint to the major card networks called GH-Link, where a lot of the banks, because they are a modular network, are being convinced and persuaded through all manner of tactics to move away from international card networks to this GH-Link. Now, what does that mean? That means, therefore, that the influence of the major card networks have significantly reduced over time. And it's possible that their numerical dominance, so their moral dominance have declined, but it's also possible that their numerical dominance will decline over time. In short, the fear that the mega networks, particularly the mega platforms, whether it's Uber or Airbnb or the likes, will grow so powerful that we risk a potential colonial situation in Africa, maybe overblown. I think that would be the most relevant connection between that work, though there are a lot of other features that we can discuss if they do become relevant in the course of the discussion. But the simple summary is that it's likely that the fear of a new colonial situation arising out of Western-dominated platforms may have been overblown. Other issues are more important. Thank you.
Thank you, Bright. That's fascinating. I think it's a great segue to the next question I have to all the panelists in providing the reflections and comments is the risks that are associated in this platform world, this universe in which platforms do exert a lot of power, but also generate benefits, as we're hypothesizing here in the generation of digital livelihoods. So do we think that iWork can increase income over time in Africa, or are we still on track to be at a race to the bottom? What do you think? Do you agree? And what conditions do we need to have in place for this to be true? I think I hear from many of the panelists. And I encourage you to also enter into discussion. Feel free to interject and interrupt.
Hi, Bright. I think that you've made a few good points, and I think the beauty of this whole thing is that, fortunately for Ghana, it's an opportunity now where we can make an input in the direction of how we want to see this. And so how do we get more people at this early stage to design and really look at the framework to develop a process and how to look at iWork. So maybe we should start looking at that opportunity and work on it so that we can safeguard the rights of the iWorkers and ensure that the right thing and the right policies are put in place. I also would like to say that this is actually, it's possible to increase incomes for iWorkers in Africa over time. And the reason why I say this is that there are a lot of national efforts aimed at improving technology and logistics, which is very key for the iWorker if we're looking for expansion and looking for growth. And so we need to be able to have government play a strong role. And I'm speaking in terms of government because of my role and how we can bring them on board to improve the technology and logistics to enable more of the businesses or SMEs to scale up and be positioned to trade more, to be positioned to be part of the global market. Because personally, I think that iWork is going to be the future. It is the future, and it is now. And so we need to be able to see how government can play a major role in that. I also believe that incomes can be increased if we're also looking at it in terms of the financial services and the access that is now coming on board, which allows for more trade to happen, because now we have more. We have mobile monies. People use mobile monies to access a lot of the things they're doing through iWorkers. You have the payments platforms. You also spoke about the Ghana language. You talked about, there are also other things, other platforms that with the expansion and having access and having numbers would increase the incomes for iWorkers in Africa over time. I'm also looking at it from the point of how we address cybersecurity issues, because it's one of the major things that could hinder it. And looking at some of the bills coming in with cybersecurity, would look at how we can address that to increase trust for more people to be able to utilize iWorkers or to be able to use platforms that exist that will potentially cause an increase in income for iWorkers. Because if we're not able to increase the incomes, then what we'll end up doing is sustaining the poverty that we've done over years for such a long time. And we need to try to avoid that in this segment or sector of what work looks like and what work should look like. So it increases and improves on access to markets as well, which then allows people to have a platform to sell where we usually would not have had, or people, some of these iWorkers or gig workers would not have had access. Now with the access of having internet, with the access of being able to have digital commerce or other programs, you're able to access markets or reach people who you never were able to reach. And that comes with it, increased incomes for them to grow and you know, move. Would they give dignified jobs or not? That's still debatable.
Thank you, Cozy. Yes, was that you, David?
It was Bright, I think.
Oh, Bright?
Tricia, please go ahead.
Oh, no, thank you. I mean, I think it's certainly worth, talking about the need for growing the small and medium enterprises in COSI. I mean, given your role, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I think one of the things that it also highlighted for me, this study in Ghana and applying the iWorker concept, is just the need we're still seeing to increase in skills. So, even though we've been talking about digital skills for quite a while now, I think in the development community, I think we haven't seen that corresponding level of investment that you'd want to see. And there are certainly examples, like David said, of, the platforms investing it themselves. I mean, we have some work by our partner Caribou Digital looking at this, but really, I think we're also thinking about what are the government finance skills that are really going to be transformative in iWorkers. Because I think that question of, will this be good for iWorkers, really has to do with, not only incomes, but do they have skills for, a really, a good shot at earning a living, right? So incomes go up and they have real skills that are not just about, how to make a transaction online on a certain platform or payment system, but they have some goods or services that are actually, worth some value, whether on an online marketplace or elsewhere.
Thank you, Tricia. And thank you for the feedback, Kosi. I feel that while it may sometimes feel like a distraction, the theory is important. And sometimes without the theory, it becomes very difficult to make sense of these rapidly changing, highly diverse phenomena that we're observing. So I would take two issues head on from a theoretical point of view. And one is intermediation and the other is formalization itself. Now, one of the beliefs about platform digitalization has been that somehow everything has to be disintermediated. And therefore, more and more, the economic power of platforms is generated directly from the ability to disintermediate, to remove middlemen or to remove intermediaries. The truth is that that is not what we're observing. So if you go into the field and you look at how people actually use Alibaba as an example, you find out that what eventually happens is you have all these young, bright people that become intermediaries for what in Ghana we call your Makola woman, and that is your trader with limited formal education, who all of a sudden is told that Alibaba can help her get goods at a cheaper price than she would if she just, pick up bag and baggage and went to Guangzhou and try to buy herself. So all of a sudden, an intermediation opportunity is created in our part of the world, whereas elsewhere, the view is that, Alibaba makes it possible for people to cut out middlemen or intermediaries. Now, so that is an interesting dynamic where the anthropological dimension of our context, our sociology as Africans, it becomes very powerful. So whereas the same platform could be truly a force for disintermediation in the West, in Africa, it can actually become a force for more intermediation. I think that's the point that David was making in the beginning. We need to create unique theory that addresses the unique conditions that operate in our part of the world. And so that is one. The second, and this is taking on this issue around formalization, is to take another close look at formalization and to ask, is the dominant view about a directional or in some instance, a linear directional progress from informalization to formalization truly correct? So a lot of the ways that we've described formalization in markets like the African country that I live in, is to think of informality as a transient phase. And the goal of sound government policy is to steadily move everyone from a transient informal state to a much more highly productive, permanent formal state. But that is also not what we observe when we actually look. The latest figures suggest that 80% of all registered businesses in Ghana are not compliant with the law. And if they were to follow the law to the letter, they will deregister 80% of the companies. What you actually see when you look closely is that companies treat formalization, informalization, the rest of it as assets. So formality is an asset. And they utilize formality when it's to their benefit. And they stop utilizing formality when it's not to their benefit. So formalization and formality are features and attributes, but more important, they are assets. They are not a status. We tend to treat it as a status. And therefore, the view is, okay, will these platforms enhance formalization? And a lot of governments are more interested in that part of the discussion. Is it possible that because of Uber, I'll be able to tax drivers more efficiently? I think the real question that arises is that for a lot of micro enterprises and even bigger companies, a lot of the time they observe that they operate in an economy where for even much bigger companies, a lot of the operational capability is highly informal. So the kind of contracting procedures that are observed, the way that they get things done in the ports, the way that they get things done in government offices, a lot of it relies on informal intermediaries, etc. So that then requires us to look again at what really can platforms achieve. And here we land on three things in terms of increasing potential incomes. One is that they make this ability to choose between the formal and the informal more information driven. So the average Uber driver can use the platform to determine pricing as an example. By looking at pricing, they can switch to another platform or turn off the app off altogether and bargain. Now that means that you have a discovery mode that is made possible by the technology. So through information, the choices that are available to operators for their flexibility can mean that they earn more income. So that's one. Number two, the availability of these types of technology also equip people that are supposed to be informal with the tools, as has already been mentioned, to become much more effective in presenting themselves as formal when it suits them. So to give you an example, if I want to go to a particular location, like a microfinance institution, and I want to find a way to present my credit as better than they would ordinarily think of it, given my occupation. Of course, I could use a tax clearance certificate, which would be the formal approach. But the truth of the matter is that nowadays, with micro lending and digital lending and the like, it's not too far from reality that I can use my payment record in some micro lending app as a superior alternative to the tax clearance certificate. So this is a very powerful second factor to consider. The third factor, I believe, is the fact that these technologies also, so in addition to enabling people to present portability within their circumstances, or rather to navigate portability within their circumstances, it also enables people to form new partnerships. So if you think of all the Instagram influencers, and you consider that in the absence of these Instagram influencers, people will have to go to radio stations where the power imbalance is so massive that the ability to bargain is very limited. And you find out that with Instagram influencers, because of the variety that are available, because of the ability to select a few of them and the rest of it, bargaining power of people who want to sell to Instagram influencers is much higher. The cost of advertising, the cost of marketing can be brought down. So in those three domains, we see possibilities in very clear terms arising from the theory, how iWorkers could earn more. And I think that by looking much more closely at the theory and interweaving that with the anthropology on the ground, we get much closer to some of the insights that might guide us better.
Thank you, Bright. I think this is a good moment to tie in a question that we got from the audience is, are any of these platforms incorporating more iWorker-centric benefits, such as helping iWorkers develop their careers and progress? Do we see any platforms that are more gig worker-centric in that sense?
So Jane, if I can at least start. So I think there's some interesting work being done by the Fair Work Foundation, which is rating different forms of platforms according to a notion of fair work, which is beyond what you're describing. But one aspect is the ability to include advancement, because after all, that's something which is meant to be associated with a formal workplace. In other words, an employer that's willing to invest in training because the employer sees the benefits of that. Whereas in the iWork context, the problem is whose benefit. The platform may not necessarily see it, but it looks like some of the platforms at least realize that their own success and their own revenue, because most of them are at least the well-known ones, are privately owned, venture capital funded type platforms. Their success relies on a proposition to workers who can be productive and efficient. So I think we're seeing a little bit more of that, but there's still a long way to go because of, among other things, labor laws, right? So one of the things that's blocking, that is a disenabling factor in many countries, is a law that says if you as a platform help or provide training to a contractor on your platform, that could be deemed employment and could therefore make that whole relationship subject to taxation and other labor code issues, which make it unviable. So one of the things I would like to just point to, because then I think we'll see more examples of innovations in this space, is in fact clarifying that it is not deemed employment to assist with the training or skilling of workers on these platforms. At least that opens a space for conversation, which today is not so much there.
Thank you, David. Any reactions from the panelists?
I just wanted to jump in and echo what Bright just said about, the need to better understand what this actually looks like for workers. And I think we've been dancing around, and numerous people on the panel and through the questions have highlighted this issue of really, we need to understand, how quality is this work or this skilling initiatives? So what is really the net benefit going to be for the iWorkers themselves?
Good point, Tricia. And I also wanted to react quickly to David's point about regulation. So I'm not sure how many of you have been following, but not too long ago, a few weeks ago, in fact, the Lagos state government banned ride-sharing services that operate with motorcycles. If you've been to Lagos, and increasingly so if you've been to some cities in Ghana, you will find that motorcycles and tricycles are major ways of moving around. And the challenge was, okay, if we've seen it in normal taxis, will we see ride sharing be effective with these much more lower end transportation services? So you take a very low end industry, and then where already, you had high informality, and then you say, okay, can the technology, as we introduce it, really help with some of the formal benefits and the like? So the likes of Gokada, Max, and the rest were actually on that path. They were introducing health benefits. They were introducing a lot of training, safety gadgets, etc., for these drivers who plied various routes in Lagos on motorcycles. The problem arises this way. In actual fact, it wasn't as informal and as bleak as we thought. Before these ride-sharing apps came in, there were informal, driver unions. There were a whole bunch of local government arrangements that were allowing these motorcycles to operate, often on the blind side of the law. Now, when the technology companies came in, because they were not sufficiently minded as to the institutional context, they moved directly to what was visible, which was to give, helmets and the like to the motorcycle drivers. And then the government decided to enforce the law, which had been allowed to languish for many years. And now all of these rides sharing companies are out of business. So we need to ask ourselves a few questions arising from this scenario that I just painted. One, where you have supposed informality, but that supposed informality is rigged by a manner of informal rules, the net benefit of some kind of iWork type situation will have to take into account whether there's true additionality or not. Second, can you operate a fairly advanced, productive, technology-enabled system on the back of an institutional architecture that has not seen improvement for many years or not? I think some of the answers to those questions are increasingly no. So we're going to have to see not just the technology development, but also the institutional innovations that will support their technology. And in that scenario, we might have truly productive and well-paying iWork.
Hi.
So Jane, one of the things, Bright, you made a few very good comments about what you saw in Nigeria. And what comes to mind for me is government relations and the extent at which in this sector, and looking at iWorkers, the role of government in understanding the changes and the innovation that are coming up and how they speed up in understanding or seeing or being a part of it. And so for me, looking at two things. One, where is policy coming in? Who is pushing policy? Who is supporting with policy as well? The role of the associations, right, in playing a major role in ensuring that policy supports the work that is coming out. If not, what I also see is the killing of a lot of innovation that arises from this sector. And so how do we strengthen government relations in the work we do when it comes to iWork?
Thank you, Cozy. We're coming up on the quarter past the hour, and I would love to pursue this around better understanding greater productivity for iWorkers in this environment, and specifically posing the question to everyone on the panel before I move over to the Q&A of what you think governments should be doing specifically so that iWorker scenario is on the right path. We're creating the opportunity for greater productivity in the environment we operate in, which is that there is this informal economy that is going to persist. It's where we operate. What are your thoughts on what governments should be doing?
Jane, let me jump in very quickly because we've heard a number, I think, already from my colleagues. Cozy's just been talking about some, Bright's referred to some. To me, the biggest perhaps thing that government could really do is to really recognize that this is an ecosystem. There are connected platforms. That's why the report contains that long-term picture that I showed you, multiple platforms. Because at the moment, the fragmentation of an approach where, for example, revenue authorities are pursuing revenue, like someone has asked in the question and answer, without necessarily thinking about what the sequencing of progressive formalization looks like and what the long-term picture might look like. And so some of those profound social changes that Bright was alluding to require governments to take a step back, and that's not easy to do. Let's acknowledge that in the hustle and bustle of politics and policy making. But if they could do that, then I think it's possible to at least identify the choke points where law at the moment or policy is creating an overhang of some confusion and costs, number one. And then number two, more importantly, look at the enablement points. And let me, if I may, use that to pick up a point that I see Rani Deshpande has raised in the Q&A, which is about how do you grow this, right? How do you grow this sector because of constraints that there might be on getting enough business for them? And of course, like any platform thing, it's supply and demand. But that's why I think at least one answer to it is to build better interfaces between the training side that is providing the skills, the higher quality workers who can do better jobs, and the platforms themselves. They are there already in countries like Ghana. What's not happening are the closer interfaces, and that requires an ecosystem orchestration of sorts. That's a high ask of governments. That might be where development partners can support that. But I would say if governments could focus on those enablement points from the wider view of the landscape, not this fragmentation that's fighting narrow battles about international platforms only or tax yields increasing, then we're more likely to see productivity increase, more likely to see increased incomes of iWorkers in future.
Thank you, David. Any response from you, Tricia, Cozy, or Bright, before I move to the next question?
Yes, a quick one. So I completely agree with David on that. I feel that it's easy for governments to look at this from a regulatory and welfare economics lens perspective. And the right perspective, in my view, will be to look at this as an industrial policy issue. What do I mean by that? I mean that there's a sense in which, because of the fact that governments tend not to understand very well how these platforms function, the like of it, they tend to think of them as these xenomorphs in the body politic that they can't do anything about. You know, these are very complex organisms that are just penetrated, and all I have to figure out is how to contain them and how to milk them. But actually, there's a lot that can be done from an infrastructure development, a building of linkages perspective to make these platforms function better. And nowhere is this more obvious than the area of health and finance. So anybody that has paid attention to the Ghanaian and the Kenyan ecosystem is aware of how now governments are having to figure out how to get the disparate medical records and the electronic health records to talk to each other, and all of that work that is ongoing. In Kenya recently, there was a huge fight over what they call the Managed Equipment Services contract that was supposed to create the healthcare information technology ecosystem, and how government completely misunderstood this role as being the one to create these interlinkages. In financial sector in Ghana, we know for a fact that the work that GIPS has done has been extremely important in getting the banks, who are private sector operators, to get the leadership and the guidance that they need about their investments. And a lot of that work has been built in tents. So it's not as if, you know, all government has to do is regulate and tax. A lot of the things that government has to do is to build things. And some of that obviously could be built in partners with the private sector. But these linkages and the rest of it, if the government was to really adjust its mindset in respect of that, there's a lot of income in fees and other forms of revenue that it could generate outside taxation. So I think we have to give the government the right framework, the right lens, and that lens is the industrial policy, not welfare or regulatory economics.
Thank you, Bright. And to relate to that question, we actually had a couple of questions from the audience around taxation. And so if I summarize those, how should governments be thinking about the taxation framework so that we don't de-incentivize iWork, and we also take into the feasibility of taxation?
Jane, I see that question, for example, coming out in Till Brewitt's comment, and it reflects on what Bright said just a few moments ago, which is that so often the platforms are seen as things to milk. And of course, this is built into especially the northern discourse around tax avoidance and all these processes which are underway, the BEPS process defining taxation bases for the large international platforms that have got away with, you know, the tax equivalent of murder for a long time. But the point about that is that if we only adopt that lens, it's a confrontational lens, it's a compliance lens, and it misses, I like Bright's point about the industrial policy, which by necessity is a longer term view in which a government can actually ask, how does taxation policy encourage an environment, for example, in which the platforms that we want to operate are operating? Not how do we just milk the ones that happen to be there today, because you can drive them out. And for example, how do you incentivize that they do certain things? For example, allowing portability of worker data if there isn't a data law that requires that. So I think the real point is just to say taxation really in this area, if seen narrowly and not seen in that broader garb of industrial policy, is, I think, very dangerous and could discourage at early stages a sector that's in great need of investment and development on both sides of the platform for it to work.
For most, I think when looking at what we're talking about today, looking at the formal and informal sector, for many years when people talk about the informal sector, they think taxation. And it's a question that keeps coming up in our discourses in government, and looking at how best to, as was just said, how best to incentivize people without looking at tax as we're here to regulate, we're here to look down, we're here to take what you're getting. But then when it comes to the informal sector, it keeps coming up in the conversations, especially with government, when you're looking at how to be innovative in ways to increase the tax bracket, because it's one of the bigger challenges, especially for a lot of African countries, when you're looking for more revenue to implement programs or some of the policies that you have. So unfortunately, when we look at a system like iWorkers, and you look at what can we do, the first thing that comes to most of the government's mind is taxation. And so, like you rightly said, how do we look at it differently? And maybe we need to delve deeper into that to ensure that the first thing we're thinking about is not taxation, but how to create a stronger enabling environment that will make them grow and actually allow them to contribute more to the economy.
Thank you. One of the audience members was asking if a way to avoid looking at governance and platform interactions in a fragmented manner is to consider it along sectoral lines, through a sectoral view.
Well, I would say, Jane, to that yes, the sectoral view can help. That's in some ways the spirit of that long run picture that we showed earlier, which is explained further in the report itself, which is so often the training programs are sectoral. They're training health workers or training particular rural development workers or whatever it might be. So I do think there's promise in a sectoral approach. But of course, with platforms, the issue there is ultimately around scale, network scale, and how they're promoted and what their brand is that brings the business on the buyer side, the people who have the work to put on the platforms. So that's where there's a need to aggregate and to get scale in terms of having effective platforms, at least. So yes, sectoral as building blocks, but I think there is a need for a broader framework to get the kind of benefits of scale on both sides of the market here.
Thank you. I'd like to start wrapping up, and in doing so, asking all the panelists what they think the call to action is here.
I think, yeah, I was just going to jump in if that's okay, Jane. I mean, I'm really intrigued by this idea of, really thinking about this as an ecosystem potential, and I think I'm really encouraged by, the experience the foundation has in working with all these really committed actors like, COSI's organization and other partners, and thinking about, what is the longer term agenda here and really transforming opportunities. So I think the call to action is one of coordination, dialogue, ongoing learning, and really keeping a focus on how this benefits workers. We can, certainly think about the different business models and incentive structures, and really always bringing it back to how is this transforming people's lives.
Thank you, terrific. From you, COSI, David, Bright.
Well, let me go ahead while COSI and Bright are considering. So I go with Tricia on the call to action is about coordination, but it's not just at the level, I think, as I hope this call has reflected, at the level of just, talking about laws more, although that's necessary. It's at a deeper level. I think it's at the level of really saying, could there be a different discourse around the nature of work as it's changing in Africa that's not too tainted, if I can use that word, by some of the aspects coming out of the global north debate, which are not helpful given the different characteristics of the labor market. So to me, the call to action is, in fact, to encourage a deeper level of conversation around what is the ecosystem of good work in the future in Africa. I have a positive outlook, but it's conditional on lots of things happening. And I would love to see call to action being an active conversation across Africa and other countries around what that looks like.
For me, echoing some of the things that Tricia and David have already said, the call to action is the fact that, yes, there are new facts on ground, but what is more interesting is not the new facts on ground. What is more interesting is the new potentiality across all the sectors due to the convergence that is happening. So as financial services converge, as medical services converge, we are now beginning to see the intersectoral and the multidisciplinary dimensions begin to flower. And I think that that means new radical partnerships and entrepreneurship at the level of government, entrepreneurship at the level of civil society, entrepreneurship at the level of the private sector, which is taken for granted, will mean therefore that we're going to see novel forms of institutions. And that is my biggest call to action. How can we create institutions that are completely inconceivable today because the technology And the new thinking allows us to do exactly that. And how will those institutions enable us to bridge the gap between equity and Pareto efficiency over time? So the emergence of new institutions that truly bring to bear all the powers of the new technology and all the imagination that is now currently being unleashed to enable us to have equity at the same time as we're promoting efficiency and productivity will be the best outcome we can imagine from this amazing new trend.
That's really, I'm very curious, intrigued to know what that institution is. Let me pass it to Cozy. Any thoughts from you on call to action?
My other panelists have said most of it, but my call to action is stronger partnerships, engagement, harmonization, convergence, so we can expand the space. If we're not talking about it and creating partnerships that would allow us to engage with one another so we can converge ideas and see what would work best, then we have a very long way to go.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank all the panelists for joining us in this discussion. I found it really fascinating and a lot to digest. I'm sure you also as attendees will have the recording available afterwards. So please visit iWorkerproject.org. It's our new website featuring the Ghana Country Diagnostic Report. You can explore the website to test the projection tool for 9 African countries. You can also hear the iWorker stories and visit our resource center with all the publications and upcoming blogs about iWorker. And we look forward to hearing from you and being part of the conversation as we push out the work and findings from iWorker. So follow us at bfaglobal.com and also on our Twitter at BFA Global. Thank you so much to the panelists, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in another discussion.